welcome to another episode of The Greatest Pod, where we discuss and debate what makes something great. I'm Ron Swallow.
I'm Ed Greer.
And I am producer Bill.
And boy, you guys, do we have a great episode for you guys today.
A bona fide author, a man with really impressive credits if you are into the things that we're into. And if you're watching this show, we got to think you are, at least to some degree.
Yeah, and I got to say, it was one of those things where when you first told us that we had this guest, I was like, cool, he writes books? All right, cool, we're a book writer or whatever. And so I go to look him up, and Oscar-winning stuff starts popping up. George Romero, posthumous collaborations pop up. He's writing a comic. It was just like, we get to talk to this guy? I was genuinely floored. I did not know how to handle it when I first discovered that we had this guest.
Oh, I was pretty pumped up, too. I mean, authors, that's one of my favorite things. Like, He also writes fantasy, sci-fi-ish type stuff, and a little bit of horror as well. It's pretty great.
Yeah, and I think what's great about the episode is we really get into some process stuff. I mean, we get deep into how do you think about characters and write characters, and specifically as it relates to the character that he's here to talk with us about, which is really a character that almost, when that character debuted, we had never seen anything like it before. He almost created his own archetype.
Absolutely. And it's funny how that goes hand in hand with the fact that George Romero created the modern zombie movie. So as you just stated, it's almost like Ben, his character, is the prototype of the zombie movie protagonist genre. There's a genre of character that gets to be the protagonist of zombie movies, and it just so happens that he showed up in the very first modern zombie movie. Necessity is the mother of invention, and this guy Ben is a necessary invention, especially as we start talking about him and his impact on this kid, this guy who is a kind of a luminary writer, being this influenced by this particular character. My heart grew 2 sizes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Daniel Kraus does not have the background of a guy that you would expect to idolize Ben from Night of the Living Dead. And yet, the fact that he did, I think, ended up making a huge impact both on his career and then on him as a person, really, which is great to get into.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite things about any of the conversations we have was we've said it before in other iterations of our podcasts, but I love that we get to know a person when you learn about what they love and what they consider the greatest and or most important influences in their life.
Absolutely. This, if I'm not mistaken, this was our first interview that we did for this new version of the show. And it was a hell of an interview to start with because Daniel was super game, was really into the questions that we were asking. We were really into his answers. It's a love fest all around. So we think you guys will enjoy this one.
As always, I'd like to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you're already Patreon supporters, you know that you get extra pods and cool art from us. And all you have to do to join that and become a new member is go down to the link below in our description and click on it.
Before you click that link, you got to listen to this interview. We have got the award-winning author, Daniel Kraus, talking about Ben from Night of the Living Dead. It's the man who literally co-wrote Shape of Water with Guillermo del Toro, which we will get into, talking about the first zombie protagonist, like Ed just said. It's a great episode. You guys are going to love it. Sit back and enjoy.
Today, I'm very excited for our guest. We got an author. He is co-authored The Shape of Water with Guillermo del Toro, whose name I can never say correctly. He's also written The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch. And coming out soon is The Living Dead, a collaboration with filmmaker George A. Romero, talking about The Living Dead. Please put your virtual hands together for Daniel Kraus.
Woo! Thank you for that smattering of applause.
There's only 3 of us.
That's true. I retract my complaint.
I'm super excited. We haven't had a ton of authors on, and I'm an obsessive reader. How did you start writing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started really, really young. I don't know if it was first grade, maybe, but I had a friend, and he and I would draw monsters. So these were probably somewhere between Godzilla type monsters and Star Wars figures type, Hammerhead and Walrus Man and those kind of things. And I think he would draw his monsters and I would draw mine. We put them in these little folders. And I think what happened was we eventually wanted to do something with them. Maybe if we had 3D printers back then, we could have printed up the monsters and fought with them. But we didn't. So we made up stories where the monsters would square off in various Godzilla versus King Kong type battles. And, we just kept going for a number of years, and eventually he stopped and I kept going and eventually introduced human characters. And I think by the time I was in middle school, I was doing definitely novella length stuff. And then by high school, novel length.
That's pretty impressive. In middle school, I mostly ran into the dirt and yelled at people. So,
well, I did some of that too.
Well, I mean, the thing that I find super interesting about your path, Daniel, is that like you seem to be one of those guys who some people start, especially in comics, that's kind of the world we come from. Mm-hmm. In comics, sometimes people start writing because they want to, like you said, do something with the characters they created. They want to be able to structure something with this thing they drew.
Right.
Yeah. On top of that, you also have eventually written comic books as well. How did you end up doing that? And do you want to talk about any of the comic books that you've written?
Well, I've only written one, and it hasn't come out yet. It at the end of August. At the end of August, my first comic, The Autumnal, comes out from Vault Comics.
I saw that when I was looking you up like a stalker. So.
Yeah, so that's it. And I actually did not grow up with comics at all. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and I don't know why, but it was like a comics dead zone as far as I can recall. Like we had, sort of a dime store type thing that had some books and some magazines. If they had comic books, I didn't ever see them, and I didn't have any friends who I know that read them. So it just wasn't something I was introduced to. So I don't even have that kind of built-in nostalgia for them that most of my contemporaries do.
Did you go to college or something?
I did.
Well, no, was it for actually writing? Because I think that's pretty interesting. How many people are great authors that don't go specifically for that?
Yeah, I didn't go for writing. It was the degree was communications, so I'm not even sure what that means. But
we are brothers in arms. Communications, that grand catch-all. I love it.
I got to jump in. Sorry, I got to jump in from the producer's chair just to ask, because I know that you are based out of Chicago, and hearing you say that you grew up in Iowa, I grew up in Chicago and went to college in Iowa. So what small town, and then where did you go to school?
So I grew up in Fairfield, Iowa. Okay. And that's about a little over an hour south of Iowa City, and that's where I went to school.
Got it. Okay. I went to
University
Drake.
of Iowa. Okay.
Yeah, I went to Drake. Yeah. That's interesting. It's funny. I actually found Des Moines had a really decent comic scene when I was there, which was about 15 years ago now. But there was an up and coming arts district in Des Moines. But having driven through some of those more far flung parts of the state, I can only imagine that there's not a ton of pop culture ephemera that gets out in the middle of the cornfields.
No, back then there wasn't, and certainly, in Iowa City at the University of Iowa, there was comic book shops.
Oh, sure, yeah,
plenty of stuff. But at that point, it just wasn't my thing. So
I know you said that you started sort of coming up with monsters. I mean, what was it? Movies that really got you into it, or was it novels? What was it that sort of got you into pop culture?
It was, I think it was a mix. I always read a lot as a little kid, and I watched movies to the degree that they were available. This was back then, of course, that was pre-video store, really. I mean, we didn't get a VHS till kind of late, a VHS player. So I think maybe by the end of elementary school, I had a VHS player, and our town had a small video store, and I really took to it fast. But it's not like I grew up with parents who were cinephiles or anything like that. Everything was slow going there. It's like that I didn't have much art input. We had a small library, eventually a small video store, and it was difficult to even know that there was art to want to get, you know?
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah, I really do relate to that, though. I do recall a time when I didn't really like when you ask certain guys and they go like, "Oh, I don't listen to music," and you go, "How could that be?" They just came up. There's a hole there where they don't need it, or they couldn't get it, and they got used to not having it. So, and some people go that their whole lives that way.
I tell you what changed my life was Stephen King's Dance Macabre, his nonfiction book about the horror genre. At some point, I picked up Stephen King like so many people did and got really into him. And just by working through his books, eventually I got to Dance Macabre, which is his history of horror. And that's, books, movies, radio, you name it. And that book changed my life because it introduced a whole world of media that I didn't know existed. He just went on and on about TV shows that I'd never seen, movies I've never heard of, books that were not available in my library. And it, to this day, I'm still tracking down some of the things he mentioned in that book. So that was a huge moment where I said, okay, these things are at least out there. And he makes them sound really good.
That is an interesting disconnect, though, between because I don't mean to dwell on this, but I feel like so many of the people that we talk to on this show, especially when we're talking about your favorite fictional character, it becomes about like I really keyed into this genre or this medium like at a very young age, and that was such a transformational part of my childhood, and then sort of matriculating into that part of my life where I understand this is something that could become a career, or this is something at least that I could be good at. I get that path, but I'm curious on this idea that you're sort of discovering that this is a viable path at the same time that you're discovering sort of a love for it, and the idea that it's almost like the chicken and the egg is hard to define in your case.
Well, the viable path came much later, actually.
Oh, okay.
So I'm maybe in middle school and going through my Stephen King phase and reading books like crazy and watching what horror I can rent from the video store. But I didn't know any artists. I didn't know anyone who knew any artists. It was still not a possibility. It wasn't until college that I really recalibrated and thought, whoa, maybe there is a career to be had here. But back then, pre-internet, like. It seemed impossible. Like no one was saying, Dan, you can be a writer. They would say, Dan, you're a great young writer, and you're going to make a great teacher or whatever. More standard, graspable jobs.
Yeah.
No, I remember those old days being a kid from Missouri. I found out that there was this mail order place that sold screenplays.
Huh.
And I blew my friends' minds. They were like, I'm not saying that they thought the actors made it up as they went along or anything ridiculous like that, but like nobody I knew anybody who knew anybody who'd seen a screenplay before.
Oh yeah, totally. Like that. I remember the first time I saw a screenplay in college. Like it just. If only I had been exposed to some sort of more urban environment as a kid, but I just never was. So my bubble of what I knew was possible was very, very small.
Well, it's so interesting because I think that also in some ways gives you a little bit of an advantage because then there's less preconceptions into things when you start actually being creative,
Totally.
Like okay, for instance, I read a ton of fantasy as a kid. I didn't do horror, I did fantasy. And then my first writings were basically imitations of Terry Brooks.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty much all the writing I ever did was just an imitation of some other guy, which is not a good way to start off things, honestly. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, one of my first, at least novella-length things that I remember writing was basically a Nightmare on Elm Street fan fiction.
Oh, cool.
That was, I don't know how many Nightmare on Elm Streets there were at that point, maybe 3. And it was like my novella version of what number 4 would be. But I do think you're onto something there. I've always thought that. So when I was writing all these novellas and books, it never occurred to me to show them to somebody. And that's sort of unheard of today. Today, there's all this apparatus that exists that you write something, you can post it online, get comments and likes. But I wrote these things and they were entirely for me. I had no desire to show them to anyone. I would work on them for months and months. And I just put them away when I was done and I would feel satisfaction. And I think that really helped. It helped me develop a unique voice because I wasn't sharing and I wasn't getting this input that would have pushed me towards a central point. It would have pushed me toward a middle of a Venn diagram of acceptability. And instead I was just developing this, my own weirdness.
Oh, I got to speak on that part. That is so awesome, Daniel, that you like recognize that about yourself and that we're talking about that, because I recently had a conversation with a friend and we were talking about like looking at everything through the lens of marketability
Mm-hmm.
will like kill you. Like no matter what you write, no matter what genre, no matter what you think you're going to do with it, if the first blinders you put on aren't your own, if they are any other concern, that can kind of ruin it. And and no matter what you're doing, even if you're doing a really commercial thing, because I'm noticing a bunch of books that you've written not really thinking about selling. Maybe you thought of it as you got into your career, but like you seem to be very prolific. You seem to have, like you said, a very well defined voice, and to have formed that absent people telling you what's what or what you should do, it's really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's would be unusual today. I think there's too much temptation, understandably so, to want to get feedback, and we grow up now in a culture of likes and favorites, and I think would be hard to do today. If I think I was young, if I was who I was back then, and had the internet and had the ability to get feedback, I probably would have done it.
Mm-hmm.
But it never occurred to me.
So what was your transition then into writing professionally?
Well, I wanted to be a novelist pretty much my whole life. And then I went to college, and I kind of got sidetracked a bit. I got interested in film. So, in my high school years, at that point, our town might have had a couple of video stores. I got really into it, and I made little movies with my friends, a little VHS camera. In fact, we actually made our own version of Night of the Living Dead. So it's kind of like foreshadowing. But so then I spent my 20s actually involved in independent film. I mostly directed documentaries that were on, and they did. I mean, they were tiny, but they did fairly well, and they all played on TV and stuff. But I got burnt out with that, and at heart, I'm really a hermit who likes to work alone. And I started feeling maybe towards the end of my 20s that what I really want to do is write. I was still at that point a voracious reader, and I decided to give it a shot. And so I wrote a novel, and I sold it, and I never looked back. I had fun doing the movies, but writing books that's what I'm here to do. I can just feel it.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. That's amazing too. I sort of feel like, again, we talked about how not having that exposure growing up gives you a unique point of view. I also think having writing be almost your second career, going through all that gives you, again, just another more unique and more well-developed point of view than somebody who's 21 years old being like, gotta sell to a publisher.
Right. And I got to get into the right MFA program. And I gotta publish a book before I'm 26 or whatever, none of that was on my radar either.
That's really interesting. So I just have to jump in because I spent my 20s developing unscripted television, and I'm trying to, that's sort of a sinking ship at the moment as well. And I'm trying to transition out of it. But I know one of the things, whether it's documentary, unscripted, whatever you're talking about, one of the things that I think, you develop a skill set for sort of teasing story out of not story, for lack of a better way to put it. Because so much of the job is about, like, I just need to capture everything that's going on, and then later I need to sit down and actually make something entertaining and that makes sense out of all this nonsense. Was that an experience that you felt sort of helped hone your storytelling skills?
I've always wondered that, because the documentary filmmaking seems so different than the kind of genre writing career that I've had. And I've always tried to figure out if there's any linkage between them. And I think that's the most likely linkage, if there is that it really is about in documentaries, it's all about editing. You just shoot everything you can, and then you create the story and editing. And so maybe there's something there. Maybe I learned something from that narratively about how to create narratives from formless blobs, basically. So yeah, I mean, had to help in some way, I hope.
That's what I tell myself. So thanks for helping me out with the validation.
I really would like to know, just for my own personal edification, like, I know that that's how you craft stories, but how do you kind of keep your momentum up? What sort of things do you do to keep your creative momentum up?
Well, for me, it's the key is something that may seem counterintuitive to others, but having multiple projects going at once is actually the thing that keeps me going. Back in, like, when I started writing, of course, I started writing novels. I would write a novel, and at least for my first, say, 3 or so novels, you'd write it, and then you'd have to kind of set it aside for a while. Then you'd go back and revise it, and then I have to set it aside for a few months or wait till someone read it. But now, when I've always got 5 things going on, they all serve as palate cleansers to the other things. So I can finish a draft of something, immediately shift to something else that's completely different and uses a different part of the brain. And I feel like I never get stuck in ruts, and part of this is because I work in so many different mediums, or not mediums, but genres and age ranges. So I might shift from something like The Living Dead, which is a fairly dense adult book. I'd finish a draft of that, and then I'd go work on They Threw Us Away, which is a book for kids that comes out next month. So, or the comic book. So all this stuff kind of keeps me awake, keeps me alert.
That's
amazing.
You mentioned The Living Dead, which is a good segue to talking about your character. But before we get into that, I wanted to know a little bit. You've kind of carved out a niche, collaborating with some pretty big names, whether that be the Romero estate or whether that be Guillermo del Toro, who you've done multiple projects with. How did that part of your career come about? How did you get into that?
Well, it's highly unlikely to start with, because as I mentioned, I really got into writing to work alone. Like, that was the whole point.
Yeah.
So I really
get
did.
that.
Yeah. I never expected to collaborate once, much less 3 times. So it really was just a bizarre chain of events. Particularly the Del Toro stuff was really just luck and happenstance. He was looking for a co-writer for the book Troll Hunters, which eventually became the better known Netflix show. And he had, I think, recently read my book Rotters. So he just was a fan of that, and I was the right person at the right time. And then when we were working on Troll Hunters is when I presented him with the nub of the idea that became Shape of Water. So all that kind of happened just kind of organically. Living Dead is a different beast, because I'm a Guillermo del Toro fan, but I grew up on George Romero. His zombie movies were my Star Wars. So that was something totally different and much more emotional and significant to me as a human being.
Who is your character that you're bringing forth before us today, Daniel?
Okay, so my character is the character of Ben, no last name, the star of Night of the Living Dead by George Romero, played by Dwayne Jones.
How did you first watch this? Like, you mentioned that it was hard for you to find stuff, so. Well,
this is the big exception to that, and this is Night of the Living Dead is really my origin story. So I'm 5 or 6 years old, and I get plunged already at that age into black and white horror because of my mom. She was a horror fan. So of course there were no DVDs, no VHS, no cable probably at that, or a very limited version. But 2 things were always on: Twilight Zone. Once a week, I don't know if it was Friday nights or what it was, I would stay up with my mom late, and who knows what late was. It was probably 9 p.m. or 8 p.m., who knows. And we'd watch Twilight Zone, and that scared me and traumatized me and thrilled me. And also, we would watch Night of the Living Dead. Now, if you know anything about Night of the Living Dead, you know, famously it was not copyrighted correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So it was instantly public domain. It seems insane, but it was. And so any theater, drive-in, TV station that wanted to play it could play it. So it was always on. It was the one horror movie constant. Any station, if it wanted to be the Saturday afternoon show or the Friday night show, it was just always on.
Well, and the funny thing for not to interrupt you, but the funny thing for listeners too is that is also the movie that you constantly see playing on television in other movies for that same reason, because there's no copyright to it. So you could just throw it in there without having to pay anybody to use it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's gotta be the number one movie within movie of all time.
Easily.
Well, it just, I was just going to say, it describes so many plots of so many different movies in an oblique way.
Yeah, totally. So, you know, it eventually I saw the other Romero movies, and they affected me dramatically too. But for a number of years, it was just Night of the Living Dead, and it changed a lot for me. And I think it changed me on a very fundamental level, the way things change you when you're so young, you don't know you're being changed.
When I watched Night of the Living Dead, I had to not watch it ever again. For probably 8 years, because it scared the bejesus out of me.
Well, what helped me is that my mom wasn't sitting in fear of it. She was laughing. She was making fun of Barbara. She fell down. It was a very welcoming atmosphere. So it really was more of a safe space. The movie actually got scarier the older I got. But it didn't start that way.
Isn't that the way, though? Because I totally agree with that. I remember some of my first time seeing it, and we were just goofing on how this chick she couldn't walk 2 feet without leaning against something into a Dutch angle. Like she was stumbling. Her entire existence was stumbling. And it was just really interesting. But then we started seeing like how your character, Ben, kind of takes control. And for me as an African American, I don't want to belabor it too much, but like it was one of those movies where I saw that he was just a man. Everybody treated him like just a man until sort of maybe some later stuff. But, you know, he was just a guy. This is your guy. It was almost like how you tell these Gamergate people, hey, you got to play with this colored guy. This is your guy. Deal with it. And you just forget because you're not supposed to think of it like that. He's just a guy.
I mean, I can't imagine what characters like that would have meant to you, but I can tell you that growing up in Iowa, I had probably never seen a black person. And yet Ben was my hero. Yeah. You know, and for that to have happened and for George Romero to have facilitated that, I mean, I think it changes me. It threw off some of the blinkers that I think other kids in my situation might have had. And both Romero and Rod Serling were so progressive and so focused on social injustice and all that stuff that I think I couldn't have chosen two better artistic role models if I'd tried.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, did you come from a progressive household or a conservative household? Because I would agree with your assessment of those two things. And for you to say that they were always on, it just makes me wonder kind of what the situation was in your house.
I think it was fairly conservative. I can't exactly nail down the politics because, you know, this was the kind of quiet, stern Iowa family where no one would say who they voted for. And, you know, there were not open conversations about those kind of things. But yeah, it was fairly conservative, certainly in a social way. And my dad, it was all my mom. He would not have let me watch these movies. And when VHS stores became a thing, it was always, you know, with a wink from my mom that I could rent Faces of Death or whatever terrible thing that I wanted to rent.
Well, yeah, I had one of those moms. She took me to see Raw, Eddie Murphy's Raw in the theater as a little baby kid.
But I bet that didn't traumatize you, right? That probably inspired you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that a leather-clad badass, and I might have already seen something like 48 Hours as well. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, yeah, I really feel like that had an impression on me, much like Ben with you. When you watched him do what he was doing, the last time I watched it, I'm struck by how he's forced to be so confident and forceful And if there was any sort of inner monologue throughout that movie, it wouldn't be, I have this all sewed up.
Mm-hmm.
It would be constant terror.
Yeah.
Like, I'm restraining a white woman. There's no one here to see me do this, so it's okay. But oh my God, if there was anybody here to see me smack her, Jesus Christ, we'd have more trouble than the zombies. All these different things, you know.
I mean, casting Dwayne Jones in that role is just brilliant. I mean, you're exactly right. He's smacking her around, and then there's this weird, tender moment where after he's knocked her out or she's passed out from fear, he like gently takes her shoes off and like kind of unbuttons her jacket so she's more comfortable. And it's just, there's these weird little details that, you think, boy, if this were any normal situation, this dude would be in some serious shit.
Yeah, but he's not. And I think that kind of underlies, I think that's one of the things that people don't pick up on that lends the movie such a reality, because it's just like, this guy's behaving this way because this shit is really going down. He doesn't have time for social mores of any stripe.
No.
You know, he doesn't have time for it. I got to board up these doors. And you were downstairs the whole time, you motherfuckers.
Yeah, I mean, I think he comes off as someone who has fought some sort of battles before. I'm not saying he was necessarily in the war or something, but he's had to stand up for himself before, or had the urge to and maybe couldn't. But now it's going to come out because it's got to come out. The shit's going down, and he's got to. You can kind of tell that, although he expresses fear throughout the movie, that he does have a certain confidence in himself. And he, when he says, "You can be boss down there, I'm boss up here." I mean, it's God. That's so good.
What would you say had you connected with him? Like when you were first watching, what is it that like you were like, this is the guy? Like,
well, I mean, I think I always, as a kid, I can't put my finger on why. I don't think I've ever talked about this before, but I always I had this urge to set myself off from the male figures that I knew. That they were largely kind of country guys, hunters, people who I saw as not being having no real interest in books, movies, TV, imagination as I probably saw it. And Ben, I remember from an early age just thinking he seemed so smart. It wasn't really his toughness that impressed me as much as just how intelligent he seemed. Like he seemed just like I'm immediately able to react to anything.
Yeah, being able to take action and also do it intelligently is such a big deal, and is not portrayed with men very often. It's usually how hard can they punch, how fast can they kick, how good are they at driving. It's not always how smart they are. So
yeah, and there was certainly a physicality to him too that I appreciated. But I don't know. I was really taken with him as a kid in all ways. I just thought he was the greatest.
Well, now as an adult, what do you think?
Well, I think it's more nuanced. One of the great things about Night of the Living Dead, and I think you can say this about a lot of great works of art, is they kind of grow up with you. And the Night of the Living Dead that I saw at age 6 or whatever was not the same movie I saw at age 12 or 25 or whatever. I have a more nuanced picture of him now. Like, first of all, he makes mistakes. He is really quite violent. He probably didn't need to shoot Harry. And he just does it mostly because he hates him, and for me, that's always one of the reasons he becomes ever the more fascinating of a character to me, is because he's flawed. And ultimately he takes advantage of the basement, which he was, and lives until the very end in the basement, which was Harry's idea all along. So Ben wasn't even necessarily right all this time. He was active and in charge and so impressive, but ultimately he might have been wrong about the strategy. But I still I don't care, like I still love him, and I love him more as just a character for having made those mistakes. Like, I don't want a perfect character. I don't want some angelic superhero, like I want a real character with flaws and a history, and who's doing his best.
Well, and also just to that point, the strategy to go down in the basement at the time that it was proposed, it was absolute madness. But by the time
right.
the situation had deteriorated, it became, to me, ironically the choice, which is how I took it the very last time I saw it. You talk about these things growing up with you.
Yeah.
Because I spent a lot of time thinking the way that you just thought. But the last time I saw it, I was like, he tried like hell to not have this be the option. And it turns out to be the only thing because of, frankly, sometimes other people's failings, but yes, you're right. A lot of his failings, because he could have led them better.
You made a great point, because he does say we can go down there if we have to, or maybe it's the young kid who says that, but he's basically agreeing with Ben when he says it. He says, that can be our final option, but let's do what we can up here.
I have to ask, so how much of what you connected with in Ben informed your approach to writing the Living Dead? Yes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, so much. I don't know if specifically Ben influenced it. I think he was the kind of proto character of Romero's career of complicated characters, and I think those in general influenced and led to the characters Romero wrote in this book. And that I picked up in the manuscript and was delighted to find is more of his characters like Ben, or almost everyone in Dawn of the Dead, or almost everyone in Day of the Dead. Like, these characters who are so compelling because they're doing their best and they're making mistakes, but they're smart. That's always what I've gone for in my fiction, is to do what Romero always did, and not have a bunch of dumb teenagers get killed, but having smart people doing smart things and then also getting killed.
Well, no, I absolutely agree with that assessment, because one of the things about these movies is you get, each one of these is somebody's first. It's almost like Stan Lee's thing about comic books. Each one of these is somebody's first. I think my first entree to this was Dawn of the Dead, and I saw a black SWAT guy kick it in a mall, and they learned how to fly. The helicopter guy and all the. It was that was my movie, and I was just like, and then I saw this OG version. It was what I considered Night of the Living Dead. And I just felt like it's almost like you choose your fighter throughout the iterations of this idea, throughout the eras. You choose your fighter with these movies.
So I think those characters were present already in this manuscript. Most of the major characters were George Romero's. I added a few characters here and there where I had to. But he had already started the work, and that's where his prose really came to life. Like when he was writing zombie action in the manuscript, it was solid. But when he was writing about a character's backstory where they had done something terrible and were trying to live with it, like that's where you could tell. That's where the prose came to life. Like it started crackling. Like that was always the stuff he was most interested in.
I want to go back to what you said, the idea of like smart people doing the things they should be doing and getting killed anyway. I mean, that is, first of all, brilliant and so much more satisfying to read. And I guess I just want to ask, I mean, as someone who's written a bunch of horror in your career, is that something that you are cognizant of as you go into every story? Like this needs to have, like it needs to have believable, rational decision making that isn't just there for the sake of scares.
Totally. I want, and maybe that's one of the major lessons that I learned from Romero, is I want you to think that these characters are making, maybe they're not always the best decisions, but pretty good decisions, and thinking creatively around problems, and even impressing the reader with their creativity. Like that's when the gang in Dawn of the Dead uses the semis to block all the entrances, or a number of things that they do. it's like it kind of gets your engine running because you're like, oh man, I wouldn't have thought of that. Like Romero had to be smart enough to make his character smart to impress us like that. So yeah, that's a big point.
Like, it's hard to write stuff like that. Writing smart characters is not easy. I would add in this, in fact, for horror, having smart characters not be able to succeed is even scary.
Yeah, and because Romero's point was always, that we people, and particularly Americans, would fail to work together in a crisis. That's all the more poignant when the people working it are brilliant in their own ways,
and even more poignant right now.
Yeah.
Oh God! But yeah, I wanted to chime in on that point though. The people working together, because in the movie we're talking about, there are certain times when if they would just get it together, they could have gotten some stuff done. But it wasn't all the way hopeless. And I always make this point: anytime in horror that it seems as though there's no way out, totally no way out, like literally no way out, that's when it goes into so-called torture porn, so-called there's no way out. If I'm stumbling across a field and I got a football field's distance between me and Jason and the road is in sight, I got a chance. If I'm chained up in a basement with cement shoes on already, it's over. You have to have that moment of hope, and also just the complexity of the story. When you look at how characters' mores and characters' choices make the plot, especially when you're given an enemy that is as implacable as zombies. Zombies are just a force. You have to show the story through the characters, because the zombies aren't going to have any emotional breakthroughs for you.
That's exactly right. And to your earlier point, they do work together at times. When they try to take the truck out to the gas pump, like that almost works.
It almost works, but that's what makes it so tragic. Yeah.
Yeah. And Harry's in the second floor, and he's pitching into, and he's throwing the Molotov cocktails, and it's kind of, it's everyone's fault, but Ben is a little sloppy with the gas, and it gets on the truck, and the truck catches on fire, and then the girl's Jackie gets caught in the seat. A number of small things happen. But it shows you that it's possible,
right?
That these people really can pull this off.
Yeah, they just don't.
Sorry, I thought you had more to say, Ed. You just said no, they just don't.
Well, no, it really is a case of they just don't. And one thing, I just want to make this point really quick. I don't want to jump to the end of the movie, but I'm going to do it. The whole point to me, this last time I watched it, I've watched it a lot of years, and a lot of times, man, I go, why not yell out in your best go to meetings voice? Why not? You know what I'm saying? Try to communicate with these other human beings. And I'm not going to make some super race point. I'm going to make a trauma point. This dude has been through so much.
Yeah.
I don't know that he can find his voice right then. And in that, he does much more resemble the so-called zombie, which they weren't called throughout the whole damn movie, I don't think.
Nope.
He was the zombie at the end. From all the stuff he'd run into, he was the zombie, and he got killed as a zombie, even though he wasn't, actually a zombie. In that moment, he kind of was.
And that's a great observation. And in that moment, anyone, but particularly a black man in 1967 or whenever this was, I think that's when this was shot. You hearing gunfire outside, you're going to approach that quietly. Like you have to get the lay of the land.
And there might not be a lay of the land. Just to put a fine point of, there might not be one. There might not be any situation where it's okay. But even then, I just think he couldn't. I think at that point, it was just everything was so ruined, and he was like barely. It was almost like a hallucination or something, and he gets caught up in this weird reverie. And you see he's lifting his weapon because he's programmed to everything outside. Got to murder, just like they are, and it's really horrible.
And I will add that as much fun as my mom and I had watching that movie over the years, pin drop silence when that finale happened. Like I've seen this in theaters too, with kind of like horror convention type crowds, and it doesn't matter where you see it. Like when Ben goes down, like whatever fun anyone was having ends. And I remember just being a kid, and I probably saw it in bits and pieces before I saw the whole thing. And when finally seeing Ben get shot, and just like not believing that would an ending like that would be allowed in a movie, because as a kid you're watching stuff that probably has happy endings, or certainly not your hero getting not going down kind of heroically fighting either against some dragon or something, just getting shot for no good reason at all. I mean, and it probably deeply affected my interest in dark literature and dark stories and downer endings and all that stuff. It just, in a narrative way, it excited me to think that, wow, you can really do this. You can really end. You can make people walk out of the theater not just feeling excited that they saw the Ghostbusters win, but you can also rattle them. And there's merit in that too.
So you really dug No Country for Old Men then?
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to write downer endings. And, and it was, and this spoils nothing because this is a Romero book, but, Romero was a pessimist. He really was. He was a cynic. His wife said he was a glass half empty guy. And there was really no chance of The Living Dead ending overly happily. Anyone who's seen a Romero film knows that sometimes there's sort of a glimmer at the end, but he was pessimistic about humans.
I mean, I don't blame him.
When you adapt and you work with other people and you shape things that may have already had certain bones already, or you have people come in with stuff that you already have bones of, how do you keep from being like covetous? Like, this is mine. How do you truly collaborate in these ways? Because you seem to be great at it.
Well, I mean, even when I'm working alone, I try to set myself up with problems. And when you're starting out as a writer, you don't need to do that because everything's a problem. You're trying to figure out how to even write a book. But when you get further into career, I found it very helpful and enjoyable to stick myself into situations, whether it's a really specific voice or a structural conceit that limits my options, or I did a book last year called Blood Sugar, in which I used very few bits of punctuation, and even things like that. They all force you to write differently and work differently and think differently. So what collaboration does is it creates those obstacles for you, because you're dealing with somebody else who has their own ideas and their own druthers about things, and they're not always going to be yours. But you're going to have to work together. That's the whole point. You want that kind of conflict. You want to be able to bump up against someone and have your ideas. Mostly you want to agree. Otherwise, that's going to be a terrible collaboration.
Yeah.
But you do want to have ideas that you have to say, all right, I'm going to give my collaborator this one, but how do I find my way into it? How do I get passionate about it? What's my inroad to understanding this? And even with this book, where George wasn't alive to collaborate with me, the fact that he wrote his material was spread out through the book, it wasn't concentrated in the beginning, gave a lot of those obstacles to me. I could never get too far afield into Daniel Kraus land, because I'd always have to come back and hit these other points that Romero had laid down.
That's interesting. I have to ask, do you feel that there is any untold story or untold part of the story that you would want to tackle when it comes to Ben specifically? I mean, is there sort of a prequel in there that would be worth telling? I mean, are there any threads that you would want to pick up from his story?
Wow. I've never actually thought about that before. That's kind of amazing. I don't know what the rights issue would be on that. I know the film is public domain, but I don't know if it's Romero and Russo, because they both wrote the screenplay together, or the Image 10, who owns kind of the Night of the Living Dead as a concept. First of all, I go immediately to legalese. I don't know if that's legal or not, but
let's pretend it is.
It's a fucking fascinating idea. Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
just don't have him be a carpenter. Like, oh, this lowly carpenter found himself in a in a situation where he had to nail up a bunch of boards.
that would explain why he's so good with the hammer, right? Well, in the original script, which I have out of reach here, or otherwise I'd refer to it, he was written completely differently. His name wasn't Ben; it was just truck driver.
Oh wow!
And he had a much more kind of country style, like vocabulary and style of talking. And once they cast Dwayne, of course, that didn't work at all. That just wasn't who Dwayne was. So they let him, I think, bring a ton of sophistication to the role.
No, I think it stands in direct contrast to how we see the sheriff and all those bumpkins.
Yeah.
Like this dignified black man nailing up clapboards, and then outside the justice force gonna enforce the justice. We here are a militia killing zombies, wink wink. And they're just they're getting to let loose anything they had built up inside in this perfect storm of violence. You know what I'm saying? They're roaming the streets like dogs, and they're like the heroes ostensibly, but they're also this force in the background. I mean, this is my reading, having watched it like yesterday.
No, I mean, you're dead on. I mean, how long has it been since the zombies have been a thing? It's been less than 24 hours, right? Because Barbara was in the graveyard right before it turned dark. And already this gang, this militia is like really casually popping off people. Just like not worrying about and seeming to have a totally okay time doing it,
Because the sheriff was involved. I mean, the law was there, quote unquote.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because, like, one of the things they talk about a lot with Ben is how calm he is. I bet there's a story of why he's calm.
Yeah.
Like, how he's grown up is what made him calm. Like, whatever it is that in his life that makes him super calm. Like, I'm not trying to brag here, but one time a guy got in my car with a knife, and I disarmed him.
Whoa.
And then I had to drive him around. It was this crazy story. I think I've told it on here before. It was nuts. But then I also had to go to court for it. And later on, the guy called me, the defense attorney for the other guy, because I kind of I wanted him, because this guy was on meth. And I really felt bad for this dude, honestly, overall. But nonetheless, the guy was like, I got to tell you, you seemed like, well, he said a cool cat. I guess he was like, I don't know what era he was from, but he was like, yeah, you were like a real cool cat. Like, you stayed so calm. You must stay calm in weird situations. And I was like, I got to be honest with you. The way I grew up, this is just another thing that happened. Huh. So, like, I just had a crazy childhood of just being in trouble and getting into crazy shit. And so, like, I stay calm in a lot of situations just because I have to, because I learned that if you don't stay calm, you get punched in the face.
Right.
And so, like, I would love to hear a story of, like, how did this guy grow up that he had to be so calm? I actually think that's super interesting.
It makes a lot of sense. And as opposed to Harry, who's losing his mind, but that's because his world, which was probably doing great 6 hours ago, has been totally upended. And he's on the edge of losing everything.
Well, he's almost least willing to accept the fact that the world is over. Like, I mean, he is willing to go crawl under a rock. That's true. But and yeah, you know what? No, I amend that statement. He's like, let's go crawl under a rock. I don't care what's on the radio. Don't listen to the radio.
Yeah.
He really does make the transition to stay and pray,
Right.
He makes it pretty quickly, which kind of, I don't know, maybe that's Romero's, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but like some of the so-called bourgeoisie seem to be like fold under pressure like goddamn origami napkins. You know what I'm saying? Stuff gets a little tough.
Yeah.
And they're down the drain. And meanwhile, I don't know, Ben speaks really well, but I don't know how much he makes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we used to end on a battle royal. That doesn't seem appropriate for this one, but I do have an interesting idea. I'm going to swing it at you guys, see what you think. And that's how Ben would handle other movie zombies.
So not the shambling Night of the Living Dead zombies, but like we're going to just come up with how would Ben survive the 28 Days Later zombies?
Or the Shaun of the Dead versions.
Well, he would obviously throw records at the Shaun of the Dead version. That's easy.
Well, first of all, Romero would not appreciate this, but we'll do it anyway.
He was very particular about like his conception of zombies, huh?
Very particular. And in this book, the manuscript he had written, and then we discovered a lost short story from him. They both included chapters from the zombies' point of view. So for the first time, I was able to really get an insight into how they saw through their own eyes and how they smelled and tasted, felt things. And so, he was very particular, did not like running zombies, did not like the idea that zombies would go after brains. He thought that was ridiculous because the skulls are too hard and you have the whole body to feed on. And so he definitely was particular, and I stuck to his particular. That doesn't mean we can't do this. So let's do it.
Well, no, I think I want to acknowledge that because there are some film nerds right now who would watch that OG Night of the Living Dead and be like, the daughter zombie clearly uses a tool. They don't use tools. The other zombies smash the windows out. The lamps out, the headlamps, headlights out of the car willfully, like, yeah, damn your lights, bang, bang, and they slam them out. They have at least a Frankensteinian understanding of lights and stuff like that, and they use rocks. Whereas most zombies, you see people fending them off, they just put their arm under their chin because all they do is bite. They don't even flail their arms, some of these zombies in these movies. So there's all these different ways to see what they are and what they do. In your particular case, do you think that they can use tools, rudimentary tools?
Yeah, I think they can. One of the things that I did was, in addition to having that kind of new insight to the zombies, I watched all the movies again, obviously more than once, and took note of just every little thing they did and didn't do, and created this sort of master document so that I could always refer to it. So I would have every evidence that Romero left us of odd things that they had done. In Survival of the Dead, a zombie rides a horse. So there were, that's just one bizarre example. So there are things that they can do, especially if they've done them before.
I was going to say, like, if in their brain there's a habit, like you think about how once you do something enough times, like say you're a carpenter, for instance, you've swung a hammer 1,000,000 times. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that your brain still remembers the muscle of swinging a hammer.
Yeah, the muscle memory.
Okay.
It's,
okay, by that rationale, so their zombie shack is down at Staples Center bricking free throws right now.
And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's kind of awesome, actually. Like there's in Survival of the Dead also there's, they have kind of a mailman zombie chained to a mailbox, and he just kind of goes back and forth to the mailbox trying to deliver the mail all day. And there's something, and of course, Dawn of the Dead, of course, is the biggest example. They just all come back to where they like to go. And there's something really sad about that, actually. The postman thing is sadder than the mall, but they're both kind of sad because if the fucking mall was that important to you, that's sad. And also sad is if, the thing that you remember so much at the expense of every other joy you might have had in your life, but you just remember delivering the mail because that's all you did. That's also sad. So there's, Romero was really good at plumbing pathos, and
I could see some weird, crazy world where like corporate people get zombies who were athletes and just like put them in football fields to make them play sports, and everybody goes and watches them.
You know what this is starting to sound like, and I had actually never made this connection, but these are like the Tethered from Us, Jordan Peele's Us.
Oh, shit.
Like that's kind of what this sounds like, where they're just sort of operating on this very baseline level of like, this is how I live, this is how I survive.
Interesting.
So that kind of brings it all full circle too, because like he's so inspired by the Twilight Zone, and so many of his ideas kind of come from that same wellspring.
Yeah.
It almost feels like, his conception of the tethered is almost is similar to what you're talking about. Romero was thinking with zombies.
That's interesting. I mean, I know he's a huge Romero fan too. So yeah, that's not something I'd heard before. But I will say, in The Living Dead, the novel, there's a sequence that is very close to what you just said, where there's rich people who put their zombies in football uniforms. It's not exactly that, but it's very close.
Before we let you go, I want to ask, just because we are so heavily into comics here, and that's usually a lot of what we talk about, how have you found writing comics to be, given that you're kind of wrapping up your first foray into it here?
So much fun.
Okay.
It's the funnest new thing that I've discovered in many years. I mean, obviously, as I did eventually read some comics in my life, so I'm familiar with comics now. But I certainly had never written one before, and like I said, I like new challenges. And what's so new to me about comics that isn't the case in books and is not the case in screenplays is that you're dealing with the page as a physical thing. Like, it is its own entity, and a page turn is its own entity, and a page spread is its own thing. And so you're feeling out these very physical beats, and that makes editing more complicated, because if I have an editor say, well, we need a little thing where someone has this, I don't know, this conversation, it has this domino effect. Like, well, yeah, that screws up all my page turns, you know? So I like that additional level of thinking. And it's also just, as opposed to, screenwriting, which it's similar to in a lot of ways. I like the close to immediate gratification. Comics moves with such speed that it's cool to write a script and then see the art kind of just birth out of nowhere, and then the colors, and then the lettering, and then the fact that the lettering comes at the end. So it's like you've almost by that point forgot your words. You're just being dazzled by the art. And so then the words, which were were the seed of the whole thing, become like the last thing that's added to it. And it kind of allows me to, and this never happens in books, to re-experience my own words and be surprised by them and gratified by them and say, wow, it created this whole other thing. It's really fun.
Yeah, so basically just plug some of the things that are out now and that are coming out.
So I'll just give you this 12-month period, which was my busiest ever. I Blood Sugar, which came out from an imprint called Hard Case Crime, which publishes a lot of living and dead crime stuff. Stephen King has done a couple of them. Like, people, it's a cool little club to belong to. They do these vintage kind of pinup covers and stuff. But the darkest book I've ever read is a YA novel that published in February of this year called Bent Heavens, which is kind of like E.T. if the kids decided to torture E.T.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, it's really intense. I honestly, I hope I never write anything darker. It was almost too. Living Dead, of course, with George Romero is out now. And then next month will be my comic book, The Autumnal. And then the first book of the Teddy's saga, They Threw Us Away, which is my first middle grade books, which is sort of a Watership Down type tale, except with teddy bears, and is darker than that sounds. It's pretty dark.
Dude, there's probably going to be a lot of stuffing all around, huh?
There is. I mean, that's the great thing about teddy bears as characters is you can do things to them that you couldn't do with living characters. Like, you can really put them through the ringer, pull out their stuffing, tear off their eyes. I mean, you can do all sorts of things to them, and they have to kind of struggle on missing parts. So it's for someone like me, it's a real playground of mayhem.
So hardcore. Awesome. Well, so thank you so much for being on, man.
Totally my pleasure. Anytime, guys.
So that was our episode with Daniel Kraus talking about Ben from Night of the Living Dead.
Definitely one of the greatest horror movie protagonists of all time, and one that doesn't often get mentioned in the likes, alongside the likes of, say, Ripley or Laurie Strode or some of these other, more modern characters. But Ben is up there, man, and I think we touched on all the reasons why.
the significance that he has in the racial society that they were living in at the time. I guess we could just say it, the racist society that they were living at the time is a pretty big deal as well.
Well, I mean, there was that part of the episode that pretty much moved me, where he was like, he may not have in real life seen a black person, and at the same time, Ben was his favorite fictional character and remained so throughout the rest of his life. So it's just like, that just shows you kind of the power of media, the power of representation, and all that jazz. But also, I love the fact that this might be one of the very first times that they just sort of cast the best person.
Yep.
Because I heard, in the interview, earlier versions of that character had a little bit more of a twang, a little bit more this, a little bit more that. They cast the best person and they molded the role around him. And at no point, besides perhaps the end, is it overt that they're treating him any sort of way because of his ethnicity. It's like, we're in the apocalypse. You know what I mean? Let's try to make some good decisions in the apocalypse. There's naturally going to be contentiousness, but it never came out down to that until arguably the end. So I thought that was interesting for us to explore that in this modern day and time. And he's just really a smart guy, and he contextualized that for us pretty well.
Yeah, I loved the conversation. And, I'm also fascinated. We got into this a little bit on the old show, but I love talking to people who love some of the same things that we all do, but have those major blind spots. Even on Reboot It, we get into it sometimes with Billy, who just does not have the reverence for properties from the 80s that the three of us do. He's got that He-Man and Transformers and G.I. Joe blind spot. And hearing Daniel talk about listen, I didn't grow up with comic books and superheroes. I grew up with these old black and white monster movies, and then eventually Night of the Living Dead. That's an interesting way to grow up. And I think you heard me seize on it a little bit, but I'd love to talk to more people like that who have that little bit of not the background you would expect given what they've gotten themselves into.
Hey, really quickly, speaking of his comic, The Autumnal, it's probably out right now as you listen to this episode. Yes. The Autumnal is the comic book he put a script to. And I'm so anxious to see what somebody who didn't grow up on comics does with the form, because from talking to him, it seems like he really gets it.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that at some point we may even bring up in the podcast itself is where comics might be going. Maybe this is for a Patreon, but it's just interesting that comics aren't just superheroes anymore. Comics are a vast variety of things, and we all know that with The Walking Dead and the various different independent comics that have come out. But I think they're getting to the point where you're really going to get to see them. These things that would normally be indie become a little more mainstream, and that's pretty exciting.
Absolutely. Well, guys, where else can people find you other than here at The Greatest Pod?
Ron, you go first, buddy. Your plugs are always the most interesting.
Well, pretty soon you'll be seeing one of the shows that I've been wanting to put together, which is called Positive Spin, where Ariel and I talk about movies from only a positive point. It came from this concept where people look, we can all be critical stuff. And I think criticism is important. It's the only way we improve, obviously. But I also think about all the people that work in even the shittiest movies that exist, how hard people work to make those shitty movies. And I kind of think that they deserve a little credit for having worked their asses off to make a thing. So my goal here is to look at things that might be sucky to some people or might be good to some people, but really talk about what is cool from those things. And Ariel and I are a team of goofballs, so it'll be a lot of fun to do it.
And you can check out my new YouTube channel, Negative Attack, where it's all about everything that sucks in movies you like.
I actually want you to do that.
And also, not to be interrupted by my show, where are the blacks? I ask, where are the blacks in every type of genre, from space movies to pirates, Merchant Ivory, romances. Where are the blacks? Right after Negative Attack. Attack the Block. We're a Block of Attack show.
Listen, that's a great Friday night of entertainment right there. Negative Attack followed by Where Are the Blacks?
And then Positive Spin to make you feel a little bit better about the Negative Attack. And where the fuck are all the black people?
You got to save Positive Spin for your Saturday morning. That's the thing. Ed and I've got the late night block, and then you wake up to Positive Spin.
Yeah. I like it. That's a great idea.
Well, in all seriousness, you can find me at CBillDraw on Instagram. It's where I do my artwork. You can find my art for sale at BC Studios Art on Instagram. You can buy yourself the greatest toothbrush you will ever buy at toothbrushme.com, my toothbrush subscription service where we're saving the planet and your teeth. And, of course, Reboot It, where we and the Great Billy Business are tackling iconic Hollywood franchises every week, telling you how to do it better.
You know, before we go, I'd like to point out that I got a toothbrush from toothbrushme.com. They are fantastic. They're keeping my teeth a lot more clean than they were. Also, I'd like you to check out my other website, which is fuckbillsart.com.
Fair.
Oh, and I'd like to plug my now mine sounds so germane. Basically, at Ed Greer Destroys on Twitter and at Ed Greer Destroys on Instagram. And I have done a few commissions. You can hit me up about serious commissions of dogs or big booty women. I am serious business. Dogs or big booty women, you want me to draw either one of those things, hit me up at Ed Greer Draws, and I will literally look at your request. And if it's something I really want to draw, I'll charge you money to do it. I'm that soup chef from the Seinfeld show. You either take it or you leave it. I'm a special brand.
How about a big booty dog?
No, I don't do corgi pictures.
Listen, I'm going to do you one better. I want a big booty werewolf.
Oh,
Sexy, thick werewolf.
Oh,
that is a great idea. I'd actually like to point you guys to my other website, which is Bill and Ed's Art is fantastic.com. And you should buy all of it. That's it.
I want to see more websites like that out in the world. So get on that, people.
Just
so
the
thank
sexy
you.
werewolf. The sexy werewolf rap. Girl, I'm about to launch it. Look at them haunches. Like,
let's go. Keep it going.
Please do beatbox every single day, Bill. That was the best thing.
Get us out of here, Ron.
You guys, thank you as always for supporting and enjoying the greatest pod.